Okay, so it's my pleasure to start the meeting. We will talk tonight about the political circumstances and consequences of impeachment in Peru. Peruvian policy is like a very interesting case for all the world. So we are very happy to have with us two famous specialists and experts on Peruvian politics. And this is Dr. Omar Coronel and Dr. Eduardo Dargent from the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Peru. And I'm really happy that Students Association of Latin America and the Caribbean of the University of Warsaw decided to organize this meeting, and Dorota Burdyszek will chair the meeting. So Dorota, please go on.
Okay, so good morning or good evening, everyone. I am very happy that we are able to organize the second meeting in our Peruvian series, because actually it's like this. I don't want to prolong that much from my side. I only want to say that I am very, very happy that actually through some, I will say even snowball, we reach another very important professors from Peru, which makes me very happy that our series is getting, like bigger and better. And today we are going to talk about impeachment, as Professor Bolek mentioned. And I think that we will do it like this today. As we were talking like a few minutes before, I think that this meeting will be like 1 hour and 50 minutes, something like this. So I think that today we can do it like this, that firstly, there will be a short presentations prepared by the professors, like I think like 20 minutes per each presentation. And then we'll go to the Q&A session. Just to have some rules is to the audience. There are two options to ask a question. One, if somebody is shy, there is a chat. You can type a question in the chat and then I will read it. Or another option is that you can use a virtual hand. It is in option reactions, and there you can choose a hand and please just raise it. And then we will organize it like this. And I, of course, encourage you to ask some questions. And if I think then after the Q&A session, we will end our meeting. So I think it's everything from my side, and I give the floor to the professors.
¿Comienzo, Omar?
Me
Okay.
parece que sí, mejor.
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation. I am very happy to be here, and I will try to provide an explanation of the craziness of Peruvian politics in a way that is interesting for a broader audience. So, okay, let me. Can you give me the
Okay, the possibility to share. Okay, let's check. Let's check if I can do it. Okay, Professor Bolek, do you have an idea? Because it showed that Professor.
I know.
Okay, you have. Okay, great.
You should have the possibility at the moment. Yes, please try. Yes, we can see the presentation.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, I'm going to speak about our last impeachment. This is really not the same as an impeachment, but it has become an impeachment in a way. In Peru, against our last president, Dina Boluarte. But I will try to put that in a context of why, in a presidential system, we are using so much impeachment and why it has become so normal, this kind of presidential vacancy. Also, I'm going to talk a little about, in a broader perspective, how did it happen that with little or no constitutional change, we have become a kind of informal parliamentarism. We are a presidential system with everything from a presidential system, but informally we say that now parliament has gained a lot of power, as opposed as the recent past. So that may be of interest for a country like yours, that you live already in a parliamentarism, but at the same time has seen some episodes of strong prime ministers. No, so this is kind of something very different. No, traditionally presidential systems having the president and the executive power more power, and veto capacities, but now Congress has gained some of the power. Then I will try to put very quickly what political and social changes took us in this to this situation, and discuss a little what kind of democracy we're living in these days, and then just mention how this relates to the political contest that we're starting next year, the 2026 election, in which we will elect a new Congress and a new president. So, as you may know, the Congress impeached Dina Boluarte, the president that was the vice president of the president elected in 2021 to finish a 5-year period. He was impeached because he tried to give a coup d'etat. Then the vice president that was her enemy, she has already spoke with Congress to become president, became president, and recently, less than a year before the election, very recently, she was impeached. And what is interesting is that she was impeached with 122 votes out of 130 Congress members. You only require 87 votes, which is supposed to be a lot, 2/3 of Congress, but a big majority, like a huge majority, almost all Congress voted against the impeachment. Just for you to have an idea, we are using in this case and in other cases a figure that is in the Constitution called incapacidad moral permanente. It's an article that has been in many Peruvian constitutions, and there is a debate about what it means. It's in the article that mentions the ways in which a president may lose power by objective reasons, like health issues, or going out of the country and escaping the country, or something like that. There is no doubt that the president has lost his condition in a way. But the use of this, traditionally, there was a debate. Is this madness, incapacidad moral as moral compass, you have lost your moral compass, madness, or is it such as egregious act that will not be necessary for it to be judged in the criminal system, but you have to take the president down? And this article initially has stayed and was almost never used, only used some years ago in a very particular reason. But suddenly, from 2016 onward, it has become like a normal way of using it. And even if it's the same constitution, the use has changed. Before, we used to discuss what is that terrible moral incapacitation that will lead to impeach a president. Now, if you have the votes, you can impeach the president. It has become very easy to impeach just by having the votes. Previous cases like Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, Martín Vizcarra, Pedro Castillo were either impeached or they resigned as Kuczynski because they were going to be impeached. So this has become a very automatic figure to use. In this last case, they didn't even try to justify it. They just said, well, really, she has misbehaved. But you have talked about all that in the past, and you never discussed that she should be fired or nothing. No, she has misbehaved horribly. We have to get rid of her. And they impeached the president. And the president was gone. And this is somehow surprising because after Pedro Castillo, the previous president, was impeached, then there was a lot of polarization and infighting that make us believe that the Congress was trying to get rid of the president and the president was trying to get rid of Congress. There was polarization. But Boluarte has been pretty submissive to Congress. She has been almost like a servant to Congress. And nonetheless, she was impeached. It's a strong contrast from the 2022 period in which Kuczynski and the Congress fought, Castillo and Congress fought. This time, there was a lot of peace. Furthermore, there have been a lot of proposals for impeachment, and the majority of Congress voted against. Like the main parties that now control Congress, they were happy with the president. They didn't want to impeach her, and they basically, almost all the benches, all the different political groups in Congress voted against impeachment. No? Only 2 parties voted consistently for impeachment. So this was kind of surprising. let's have some context. Boluarte was incredibly unpopular, like in the higher 90s, popularity in popularity and popularity in the lower 10s. And Congress was also unpopular. So what happened? Why did she was impeached? The immediate cause is that it became a very high electoral cost for Congress to defend Boluarte, this very unpopular president, just before elections. One of the members of the congressional majority declared that they were going to support the impeachment asked by those two groups that were trying to impeach the president, and suddenly all the others felt obliged to join, like very quickly. And in a normal day, Boluarte started the day believing that her life was a normal day as usual, and by the night she was impeached. Like it was really quickly, and shows how common has this figure of impeachment or incapacidad moral become, no? In a way that is no longer any kind of almost any kind of guarantee, because it depends on the popularity of the president and how Congress feels about the costs of maintaining or not a president in time. No, even if Congress wants to take control over the executive, it's very easy now to get rid of the president. The background for all this is that there was a huge security crisis. There is a growth of extortion in Peru. Peru is not as a violent country as others in Latin America in terms of killings, but it is a country in which extortion has grown a lot, even in very day-to-day activities. And that has created that extortion of bus routes, of small businesses, has created an insecurity problem, very big insecurity problem. Boluarte has been described as an incredibly incapable president to deal with the problem. And there was a shooting in the previous days that increased these demands, and Congress said, yes, she's not doing anything, let's impeach her. This is basically a very unpopular Congress getting ready for the election. No? They knew that if they wanted to defend Boluarte, that was going to cause them problems, and their leaders that are going to run in elections for the next year, so they get rid of her. However, they did not reach the grab over power. No? Usually, we were thinking, well, if they are going to take control of the executive, they should send a member of Congress that is not linked to an unpopular Congress. Nonetheless, they decided to send the current president of Congress, who is a politician that has had some political experience within his party, but was not like a widely known or well-known politician. But they decided to keep the pact, the congressional pact, and say, well, if you are president of Congress, you become president now. There were no other vice presidents available to become president, and that was in that moment that was seen as very risky, because that was linking Congress to the presidency in an electoral context. Nonetheless, I'm not going to go into big detail about this, but the president has achieved popularity mainly because he has been acting very openly towards the population, doing things related to crime, and showing that he can be much more open and active than the previous president. I think a lot of his popularity comes from the previous president, lack of popularity. Nonetheless, he seems very, very comfortable not clashing with Congress, no? And that can be a limit to his popularity eventually, no? But nonetheless, now the president seems more popular than I think we suspected he could be. But let's look at the antecedent conditions. How can we explain that a country that was presidential became this kind of country, no? And this happens beforehand in Peru. The executive, even if it only had a minority, a bench in Congress, the executive was able to control somehow Congress and control the mesa directiva, like the conduction of Congress, by making alliances with the smaller parties. Peru is a country with very weak political parties, so parties in Congress divide. They form new alliances. The executive profited from that. The executive is the one providing the fund for many things in the country. So many of these groups will form alliances with the executive and be in charge of Congress. But in 2016, a very weak executive reached power, only 17 benches, 17 congressmen, while the opposition, Fujimorismo, the party of the daughter of Alberto Fujimori, had 72 benches. That's like almost 60% of Congress. And that created that, and many corruption investigations that were being done during those years created a lot of tension between Congress and the executive, and Congress used their power to attack the executive consistently, starting to use many of these constitutional figures that were seen as highly unlikely to be used. One of them, the impeachment process, but not the only one. I will not go into the details, but there were also other figures in the Constitution that allow the executive to protect itself and even attack, because it allows you to, it's a cuestión de confianza, confidence questions. It allows you, by the wording, it was really bad, it allows you to say to Congress, you should do this, and if not, I will take it as if you are taking confidence from me. And if you had 2 strikes of those, you could dissolve Congress. That's what President Vizcarra does in that moment in 2019, dissolve Congress. But the new Congress that gets elected, there was no majority there. The president didn't have a party, so he had no congressman. And all these fragmented all these parties of the fragmented Congress have learned how to use all these weapons and to use the power of Congress to advance their interests. And suddenly you have a fragmented Congress, but acting in the same way as the previous one, and eventually impeach the president. The 2021 election was somehow typical for Peru because there was polarization in territorial cleavages, critical cleavages in the left, in the southern part of the country, voting for a candidate that was critical of continuity and economic model, and again Lima and other parts of the country supporting Keiko Fujimori, which became the right-wing candidate. So that was typical. We have seen that in 2011, 2006, this kind of division of the country, no? But this time there was a more pressing presence of a populist right or populist right ideas, very present and polarized in the election, no? So there was this leftist candidate with his own authoritarian moods, and on the other hand, you see a lot of this kind of new authoritarian. It's not that we didn't have authoritarian right, we did, but this kind of a style that is very populist and can be very openly and aggressively undemocratic, no? So that was the 2021 election. The polarization continued in those years. Eventually, Castillo was impeached. He tried to make a coup against Congress. He was impeached. But Boluarte, even if Boluarte arrived in this context and reduced polarization, she accepted that Congress was the boss. There was no need to polarize or discuss. She, as we have discussed, eventually was also impeached. So now Peru is almost like an informal parliamentary system, no, in which impeachment is quite easy. Quickly going over other issues, this is not the same Congress as in the past. Something that has grown in Peru. In Peru, we had like private businesses having a lot of power. We had, as I mentioned, the executive, the Ministry of Economy had a lot of power. That has been lost, some of that. The private businesses and actors have lost also some power because they are very present. They are certainly still powerful, but there are more actors now, and this kind of veto player and this kind of de facto powers that are illegal and informal actors. They are on low quality formal activities like low quality education, low quality transport, illegal and informal mining. All these actors that grew during the economic boom of the first part of the 21st century have are now much more linked with politics in Congress. So it's not the same Congress. It's a Congress that has more linkages with this kind of interest in the country, and surely they will become more important in the next election. The private formal power, this kind of business power that was very prevalent in the first part of the century, has somehow lost influence due to these other influences, no? And there's a question of representation here. Some author says, well, this is clearly these are kind of powers that are not representative because they are more like interest groups. But some of these activities are very present in part of the country, in territories, and they certainly represent some actors. No, so this is a bigger problem for democracy, I think, that we sometimes believe, because if we think, oh, there are some interest groups, then there's a way to deal with them. But if you think that they are also like rooted in society, it's much more complex. And this is some information about, you can have the PowerPoint about illegal economies, the fraud, the extortion, how this has grown, and how this permeates the political system, and the kind of things that will be important in the next election. So now there's a discussion, are we living in democracy or not? No? And I think Congress has imparted democracy and programmatic public policy in many ways. It's not a classical authoritarian actor because they are more self-interested in some way. They have reduced the horizontal accountability of other actors in society, the Constitutional Tribunal, the Ombudsman Office, and control the executive through many laws, and also to try to find the possibility of being prosecuted for corruption or other action. They have also weakened the courts and the prosecutors. No, so it's an authoritarian actor, but it's not a classical authoritarian actor. It's more like a self-interested authoritarian actors, without denying that within those groups there are some authoritarian actors. No, there are also some authoritarian actors that have a very authoritarian way of seeing democracy. No, powerful in the right, and with currently one party in the left, also quite authoritarian. But overall, everyone recognizes that there is an impact on democracy. Democracy's quality have reduced. And also important is a country with less capacity to reform. There are a lot of veto powers running around. Just to conclude, election 2026, many of the things I have mentioned will be maintained in the next election. There is electoral fragmentation, polarization in territorial terms, which I am sure will emerge again. But I think we are seeing now a more permanent polarization. The denial or fake news around the 2021 electoral election that groups on the right try to nullify has created a big division, and the repression of the 2022-2023 when Castillo lost power and there was a lot of violence and strong repression by the state has also created a lot of hate in this division, and what I think is a national crisis, no, a nationhood crisis. Today, polarization has decreased in politics, but remains quite latent and present in many territories. And we now have a very high fragmentation due to electoral rules. There were some rules that were supposed to ease registration, but with the condition of having primaries to reduce the number of parties. Well, they eased registration, but did not reduce the primaries, did not produce the primaries. So now we have more than 40 parties. You can see the polls in the last years. They have not changed. We have candidates from this ruling coalition in Congress with very low levels. There is now some other actors emerging, new faces, but all around 10%. So tradition tells us that this should not change until around February, March, when it's with the system. Since 2011, that has been the case, no? But it may be the case that given that everyone is so low, so low, anyone that jumps a little is going to create a lot of noise, because this congressional alliance and majority will more likely not tolerate much of a challenge by some of their enemies. So if just imagine that somebody rises to 10%, is going to be like an atomic bomb in this fragmented and low popularity politics we are living. No? So I don't say that's going to happen. I say that it's possible outcomes. I think there is a good chance that if somebody of these groups is selected, or new groups but with the same ideas, we have continuous same kind of politics, maybe more polarization, less polarization, but with a fragmented Congress. Congress will find a way, I think, to maintain this kind of system in which Congress rules. There might be the case of a presidential enhancement, somebody that profited from the unpopularity of Congress, and we will be in the terrain of populist politics or on a popular outsider that may use that power and the gains he makes in Congress to change the system back to something more presidential and maybe authoritarian. Or we may see something more programmatic, better democratic programmatic politics. I think this less likely because the ambience is ready for more polarization and benefiting for concentrating vote out of fighting with the current system or accusing the others of being extremists. So this kind of polarized politics, I think, makes it difficult to have an election in which 2 or 3 more programmatic, classic, traditional political groups may elect big benches in Congress and bring us back some sanity. I think the scenarios are these. I hope myself for the third one, but I think it's possible that we have more continuity or a little more of a popular executive fighting the current rules of engagement, if you want. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I hope that right now we know a little bit more about impeachment. And I think that it's time for second presentation. One more time then to the people who are new here. And if somebody has a question, please type it down on the chat, or you can raise your hand during the Q&A session, and then we will deal with some questions. Okay, so I think now it's time for the second presentation. Question is if Professor Coronel is able to share the presentation, because we had some...
Yes, already it's possible.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you.
you can
Thank you so much for helping us.
Okay, I think I'm sharing already the presentation. Can you see it?
Yep, yes, we can see it.
Great. So let me see just a second. Yeah, I think now, can you hear me well? Thank you.
Yes, yes.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm glad to be here sharing these ideas, and I hope this could be somehow useful. So yes, so I thank also Eduardo for explaining all of the context of particularly the institutional context of this situation. So what I'm going to try to do in this presentation is to talk to about the other side of the explanation about the causes and the consequences of the impeachment regarding the presence of society, of social movements, social actors, of protesters, of Gen Z actors, right? So I'm going to try to explain what are the role of these organizational actors in the impeachment of Boluarte, and what could be the consequences, or what are their role in the consequences of this impeachment. Okay, so this is the title, Peru's Democratic Crisis, the Fall of Dina Boluarte, from Mass Repression to Gen Z Mobilization. So I want to start by going back a little bit, like Eduardo did. So before the impeachment, before Boluarte, there was this very, very problematic election in 2021, right? As Eduardo mentioned, we had a very polarized election between Pedro Castillo, representing the left, and Keiko Fujimori, representing the right. Of course, this is much more complex than that, but there was a very high polarization in those elections. After all, Castillo managed to win these elections. But of course, Keiko Fujimori denounced that there was a fraud, right? Like that some institutions were working with Castillo in order to stall the elections for the left, right? Without any proof, without any evidence, of course, very similar to what happened in the United States with President Donald Trump in 2020, right? That's some sort of the same kind of strategy. So when that happened, a lot of people in the south, the indigenous region of Peru, they were, of course, angry because this polarization made that most popular sectors, poor citizens, and mostly citizens coming from indigenous regions, they voted for Castillo, right? And when Fujimori tried to denounce this fraud, her proposal was to dismiss all these votes from the South because there was no clarity about the how they were cast, and then she was saying that many of these votes may be invalid, right? So of course the people in the South, poor people, indigenous people, they were like trying to defend their vote, defend their participation in the elections, and they traveled to Lima, to the capital, and they through protests, through constant demonstrations in 2021, they demanded the electoral organizations to announce that Castillo was the rightful winner and that he will be the president. So when this happened, actually, in the end, Castillo was announced as president. His voters were, of course, satisfied with this result, and they traveled back to their regions. But there was this polarization, right? So a large popular constituents and indigenous population in the South, they were aligned with Castillo, and they were opposing Fujimori and the majority of Fujimori in Congress. So Castillo was not really a very consistent leftist candidate or leftist president. He was not really ideologically driven. He had no normative preferences for the left or the right. He was very pragmatic in general, but sociologically, he represented this population, right? Ethnically, in terms of class condition, in terms of his geographic precedence, all of that represented these popular sectors, and that was enough in order to satisfy many of his voters. And of course, there was also this opposition in Congress led by Fujimori against Castillo, trying to block all of his policies. In the end, when Castillo was accused of several corruption scandals, he tried to organize a self-coup in December 2022. And of course, he was not successful. He was not successful because he didn't have the support of nobody relevant, nobody from his coalition, nobody from the army, nobody from any social organization really prepared in order to defend him. So he was arrested like 2 hours later after he announced his self-coup. We're talking about a very, very weak political figure, right? However, after that happened, many people in the South who are not really organizing a movement or a party, there are not, as Eduardo was saying, parties are not really relevant actors when we talk about society, right? There's civil society in Peru, citizens in Peru, we are not attached to political parties. However, the Castillo electors were attached to Castillo. So they believed in Castillo. And most important than that, they rejected Fujimori and they rejected the Congress. So Castillo had much more popularity than Congress. Castillo, when he organized his self-coup, he was around 25, 30% of support, and the Congress was around 10%. So when Castillo organized his self-coup and he was arrested, many people from the South went to the streets and organized a lot of protests. Immediately, as Eduardo was saying, Boluarte, the vice president of Castillo, who of course had nothing to do with Castillo and nothing ideologically connected, I mean, she was another outsider, she became the president only under the power of Congress, of the majority in Congress, of course. The majority in Congress, allied with Boluarte, they decided they were not going to tolerate any protests against the transition. So they organized a very, very harsh repression. So we are talking about 50 citizens who were killed in that repression. Citizens mostly from these indigenous regions in the South. Many of them were not even participating in the protests. Many of them were underage, right? So this is a massive human rights violations. So in the past, since the transition in 2000 to 2021, when something like this happened, there were some checks and balances that limited the level of repression from the executive, right? So you had an opposition in Congress who would push for accountability. You had the Attorney General's office, you had the Ombudsman, you have the media, you have other institutions trying to prevent the advancement of repression, which is what happens in a democracy. So in this case, that didn't happen. And what we had was this huge level of repression with 50 people killed, widespread human rights violation documented, right? And that's how this, what I call an authoritarian coalition was put in place, right? So they are not leading, as Eduardo was saying, a classical authoritarian regime. This is not, Peru was not an authoritarian regime by them. It's not an authoritarian regime now, but we are clearly in a process of autocratization, right? So why do I say this? Because not only because there was this checks and balances that were broken, but also because the affection of civil rights, of political rights was also diminished, right? I mean, there was no accountability on these 50 killings during the protests. And that never ever happened before during the Peruvian weak, but still a democracy in 2000, between 2000 and 2021. So we were in a different situation. Still a very weak democracy, but qualitatively changed, right? In a constant process of autocratization. So the result of that, of course, was a deep trauma and civil society demobilization. What you're seeing here on the right is a map of Peru, and the regions that are with this brown color are the regions that had more people, more number of protests, right? So it was the south, particularly the indigenous regions in Peru. So the second thing is the process of demobilization that continued this process of 2022 to 2023, right? So between 2023 and 2025, we had a very silent civil society in Peru. And this was like very puzzling because, as Eduardo was saying, Dina Boluarte became one of the most hated president in the world, in the sense that her level of popularity was really, really low. I mean, around, as you can see in the graphic of the right, around 5 and 2% in the last year. So she was a very despised political leader with no legitimacy. The Congress was in a similar position. So, of course, people around the world was wondering, why do you support, why this president is not ousted by civil society? In other contexts, civil society could reject presidents who were unpopular. For instance, in 2020 with President Manuel Merino, right? So why Boluarte was so resilient? Why Congress was so powerful, even though they were so weak? And my argument is that, of course, we were still in a very weak democracy, but an autocratizing democracy, which has some particularities, right? So what you had is a civil society which was traumatized by repression, with a lot of fear of state violence. So of course that demobilizes the civil society that in other cases could have pushed away Boluarte. But besides that, we had an opposition fragmentation, right? In other cases, we have a unified opposition against a leader, against Merino, against Fujimori, etc. So we had some opposition blocks that had a lot of differences, but could coalesce into a momentaneous alliance. In this case, we didn't have that, because many people in the opposition were supporters of Castillo, and many people in the opposition opposed Castillo. They rejected Boluarte and the Congress, but they also opposed Castillo, and that generated a deep tension among the opposition that difficulted the organization of protests. Also, we have this perception of inefficacy, right? And the idea that protests don't work. Because in other cases, from 2000 to 2021, people in Peru protested a lot because protests were useful, were um, an efficient way of trying to call the attention of authorities. But in this case, this was not happening anymore, and particularly with political demands. So people saw that protests are not working, so that's why also most people would not join any calls for large demonstration. And also political hopelessness, no? The idea that even if Boluarte is even if Boluarte is out, what will come next, right? People was not very hopeful about any change, any better change, an improvement. So people were saying, if Boluarte is out, probably the one that comes next is going to be the same or even worse. And of course, all these four factors, the trauma with repression, opposition fragmentation, perception of inefficacy, and political hopelessness would in aggregated, demobilized civil society. So Boluarte remained unpopular but untouchable, right? The Congress would protect her, and civil society, even though they despised her, civil society was not capable of organizing a large enough demonstration in order to put her out of office until September 2025. So I think definitely the role of parties, the calculations, the strategy of political actors in Congress are key to understand why Boluarte was ousted, but it's not the only factor that we need to take into account. Before October, in September 2025, there was a reactivation of protests led by young people. So young people, particularly in Lima, were not demonstrating against Boluarte since 2023 because of all of the factors I listed, right? However, something happened in September. On September, the Congress approved a reform of the pension fund system that would affect directly the young people, right? People under 40. So that economic issue actually activated many young people who were not protesting in order to demand some change from this policy, change of this policy from Congress. And suddenly on September 13, you see a lot of young people protesting in the streets against this pension fund reform. So it was a surprise. And I think it was because the protest was large because this time was not only political, it was about an economic affectation, but also because this was not generating a divide, right? It was not like Castillo that made it difficult for protesters to unite, right? Because some were saying you are on favor of Castillo, some were against Castillo, and that was a very important problem. But in this case, they were all united against this pension fund reform. So, and also it was an economic issue, right? So that moved these young people into to the streets, and very, very surprisingly, Congress actually listened to them. So 2 days after that protest, Congress changed the law, changed the regulation of the law in order to take out most of the points in the law that youngsters were protesting against, right? So when young people saw that they actually had some power to push back Congress, many of them started demanding more things. So the protest of September 13 continued the next week and the next week. And for 1 month, young people were on the streets demanding not only against this pension fund, but also demanding about security, because as Eduardo was saying, we are in the middle of a security crisis with a lot of extortion, homicide rates going up. So young people started demanding security, actually, that the government can do something about this. And then they started demanding not only security, but also reforms against corruption. So in the end, when these protests were advancing, most of these young people were, by the end of September, not only asking against, not only demanding for an economic issue, but also for a political one against Congress, against Boluarte. So it became really, really political. And of course, Congress members were not really listening too much to these protests, but they were growing. And then what we see was that also the transport workers started joining these protests and announcing they will join young people in the protest of October 15th. So there was this threat, this menace. Now that it's not only young people, but also transport workers that were going to stop. They were going to mobilize during October 15th. And Congress members were kind of preoccupied. They were worried about the situation. And after that, you have this particular issue that was the attack, armed attack to a beloved cumbia band, a music band, when you see the artists joining the protest, announcing they will also participate in the demonstrations of October 15th. So when that happened, when you see this indignation, this outrage in civil society, it was not only protest, not only young people, not only transporters, but also artists and larger members of the civil society. Congress members realized they now had a large coalition willing to go to the streets. So this affection was no longer only in the polls, but also in the streets. And that was a huge threat, right? So my argument about Boluarte is that about the impeachment of Boluarte is that we have to understand what happened, we had to take into account these two factors, right? The institutional factors, but also the social pressure. So we had this, regarding the institutional factors, this electoral cycle pressure, right? It's different 2022, 2023 to 2025 because the elections are really, really close. So Congress members who want to re-elect for the Senate, they were more interested in trying to not to oppose the will of the majority, right? So the Congress, in this context of the elections, they needed somehow legitimacy, right? So that's very important, and that's one of the main reasons they actually impeached Boluarte. But that wouldn't be enough to understand the process if we don't take into account the social pressure, right? Because there was a credible threat of massive mobilization on October 15th. Multiple sectors unified, which was very different from 2023. And actually, on October 15th, there was a large protest in Lima, which something that never happened on 2023. It was a major threat, right? And the third issue is that it was impossible to ignore without a major political costs. So that social pressure added to the institutional factors provided this result, right? That the Congress removed Boluarte via moral incapacity, right? All the process that Eduardo already explained. So what happened now? I mean, we have this Gen Z, Generation C mobilizations, organizations, new organizations. Is that going to change something? So Eduardo already mentioned that we have like 40 parties for the 2026 election, that no party or no political leader is really generating a lot of expectation. No candidate is going up of 10%, right? But what about civil society, organized civil society, these youngsters, these transport actors, these other organizations in civil society? What is the role, right? Now that we have this new president, Yeri. So what I think is that the current situation after Boluarte is that we have a new president But of course, as Eduardo was saying, nothing has changed too much. I mean, Jerry is much more capable of Boluarte, of communicating with civil society, communicating with the media, communicating with other political parties, and he's trying to do something about the security issues. I mean, nothing really very useful, but he's mounting a show. He's mounting a show that it's very useful, and it's proven that it's useful because his popularity is still up. Probably this is just momentary. We don't know, but at least he's popular enough to survive until July 2026, right? Uh, However, Congress is still deeply unpopular, and most people realize that Congress has a lot of power uh, still, right? The other issue is that Generation Z organizations are now divided. They are fragmenting. They have become weaker. Because of the situation, right? I mean, the repression on October 15th, with the killing of one protester, show that the government still has he's still very willing to repress in a violent way all kind of protests. So that, of course, impacted again in demobilization, but also the popularity of Jeri. So, like 1 month ago, many people, including me, we thought Jeri was not going to be very popular. Of course, more popular than Boluarte, but Jeri is much more popular than Boluarte, and his activities trying to show that he's doing something about the security crisis is paying off. So protesters right now, they realize they cannot ask for an impeachment of Jeri or to oust Jeri, because over 50% of the population right now supports Jeri. So now they don't really have a clear demand, right, in this moment. So that led to a demobilization, a fragmentation, a division within the Gen Z organizations, right? So what are the likely scenarios taking into account this social dimension, right? So I think, unfortunately, these social organizations will likely dissolve or fragment in the short term, right? So in December, January, February, probably they will not have any relevance. Maybe in the context of the 2026 elections, right? Uh, Probably for the second round, some of these organizations will reactivate in order to protest against a specific candidate, probably against the candidate representing the authoritarian coalition in Congress, right? But I'm not sure they're going to be massive, or they're going to be determinant, or even if they're going to have some real influence in the elections. In other situations in 2020, even in the 2000s, when students and young people actually protested and they were more successful than now. The next year, the year of elections in 2001 or 2021, these youngsters, they didn't actually have much influence on the elections. So that's why I think now these youngsters that protested a lot between September and October, they will probably they will not have that much of an influence on the elections, unless, of course, there's some leader of a party that that actually become successful at articulating these organizations into a political candidacy. But I think that's very, very unlikely. No, in that point, we are very different from Chile, or very different from Colombia, where both Boric and Petro actually tried and successfully included many members of the young leaders of the estallidos sociales, right, into their coalition. In the Peruvian case, that's probably not going to happen, right? Because the so-called leaders of these social organizations, they don't trust any politician, not from the left, not from the right, not from the center. They don't trust anybody, right? And also they are divided, so it's pretty difficult. So one factor that we are not taking into account is the insecurity crisis that could actually trigger a new cycle of protests anytime. Now that's a very difficult to predict situation, that if we see the criminals killing somebody who's very beloved by civil society, we can actually have a new cycle of protests anytime, right? Even in December, in January, right? So that's a factor that it's hard to predict. But if something really dramatic happened, we could see a new cycle of protests, because the anger of people because of the 51 people who were killed in the last 3 years, this is still there. There's a lot of people very angry, very mad about the political actors. So that's waiting for an opportunity to actually erupt, right? So the pattern that we have now is mobilization, repression, fragmentation, dormancy, new trigger, right? That's kind of the situation that we are in, the cycle that we are repeating once and again, at least in the last 3 or 4 years. So yeah, those were the ideas that I wanted to share, and of course I'm happy to listen to questions.
Okay, thank you so much for this presentation. Okay, and right now I have question. If maybe somebody has questions for now, as I mentioned, it could be by raising a hand on writing on the chat. If no, I will ask a question. So I will wait for a moment if somebody is raising hands. I can see any question for now at chat, so I will ask. Well, because there is something like, I will say that we think that people in Peru are somehow used to the impeachment. I mean, when we take under account the fact how many presidents had such a problem and how often they are changing, we can say somehow that maybe people in Peru are somehow used to it, let's say like this. And I'm curious if this also can cause this, that society, the civil society is not that much organized when it comes to do the process, I mean like long-term process, because as professor shared with us this pattern that we have this trigger, we have some problem, there is trigger, then protests, then is still, and one more time. So I'm wondering if that maybe that people in Peru are used to this kind of situation, maybe because of this, those protests and civic society is not that strong, I mean in this way of that the protesting are lasting for years or something like this. It's because of this that somehow this is like a not that much outstanding situation, because I will say that maybe for the audience which we have here, for us it is let's say outstanding situation when the president has impeachment. I mean it's not, let's say, like a normal pattern how the presidency should end, and we know that in Peru it's, let's say, popular actually. So how it's influenced to the civil society, and as a consequence how it caused the protest or the lack of protest.
So I will start by the more institutional question, no? Like in institutional theory, the moment you start using an institution, the cost of using it is reduced every time, because there is more like a acceptance that it is normal to use it, no? And that has happened with the figure, the impeachment, this kind of incapacidad moral, in which, the same as in Argentina, when presidents disband the Supreme Court, and it becomes normal to do it, and it becomes less costly politically to justify it. Something like that is happening here. We don't see now a big debate about if you can do it or not do it, and under what conditions you can do it. I think the Constitution has to be interpreted in a completely different way. This is really exceptional. And even if you accept that you're talking about something that is not madness, no, losing your rationality, if you want, or even if you accept that it could be something different, it should be something really, really, because if not, the whole constitutional building gets eroded. It doesn't make sense in the whole constitution. But it has become normal. However, it is not the same to say it has become normal that we just accept it. It depends on the president. Like with Vizcarra, there was a big eruption of protests. With Castillo, less, but present in many parts of the country, as Omar was mentioning. And I think that the fact that you do not protest when, in the end, Kuczynski resigned, but he was going to be impeached. And Boluarte is that they were very unpopular presidents. So I believe that if you elect a president that is popular and they try to impeach it, this is an interesting question. And this is a question that will take you towards more like this kind of typical populist authoritarian, no? What will happen if Congress tried to impeach a popular president? My sense is that he could resist. He could resist, and then you have a different constitutional crisis, no? So I think you're right. We have become accustomed to the figure. There is no protest when the president is unpopular, but it remains open to be seen what will happen if Congress tries to do that with a popular president, as they did with Vizcarra in 2020. No?
Okay, thank you. And Professor, you want to add something?
Yes, I mean, the way I characterize the situation that we had between 2001 and 2021 was some sort of balance of the week, in the sense that we had some sort of equilibrium between different actors, political actors, that were, many of them had a lot of authoritarian normative preferences, but they were weak. They didn't have strong parties, they didn't have a lot of strategy. Many of them were outsiders with without much experience. And also civil society, we protested a lot from 2001 to 2021, and civil society actually had this veto power, in the sense that civil society could stop politicians, stop the Congress, stop the executive from doing things, from enforcing laws, or from producing laws that were against the will of the majority, right? Even in cases where you could see an authoritarian bloc trying to institutionalize, like with Medina, right? So the balance of the week implies that politicians, even authoritarian ones, were so weak that you didn't need a strong civil society. I think civil society get used to fight against these actors without much organization. Without much organization, civil society could manage to force them to stop, right? But in this case, it's different. So we are used to what we're used to. We're used to protest. We're used to stop things. We're used to block authoritarian attempts, right? But in this case, we couldn't, because the situation changed. The regime actually started changing faster, right? So when the regime actually changed faster, and you had this coalition of the executive and the Congress, and they were willing to repress without any limitations, civil society actors in civil society realized we are weak, right? We are strong enough to stop these political actors in the balance of the week of a democracy, but when you have this already started autocratization process, actually civil society is not prepared to stop them, because to stop them you need much more organization, different kind of leadership, right? So now we see that we have a civil society that's very prepared to stop autocratic attempts in this balance of the week. But when the autocratization already started, and you have this coalition between Congress and the executive, with this willingness to repress and to not stop before anything, you see that civil organization has a lot of limitations, right?
Okay, thank you so much for this comment. I will ask if we have more questions on the chat. Maybe somebody wants to ask. Okay, still no hand. Okay, we have questions, so I will maybe read it. Okay, it's kind of long. Okay, so when investigating polls in the country, there are a lot of people who are saying they are not sure who to vote for, or they do not want to vote for any presented option. Also considering that the country has had sort of the presidential crisis, in the country had its presidents in last 10 years, furthermore, it's not hard to understand it as a possibility internalized trend to be a staunch support of the incumbent Peru. My question is, usually, why we have a society that is disillusioned with the political model, we see populism take root and do exceptionally well. In this case, why do you think Fuerza Popular failed to resonate with the people and take power? What is Peru doing or thinking differently in the face of the new wave of populism that we see in the world? And we will end here, I think. We're reading because it's kind of long.
Okay, no, but it's a very interesting question. I think I think it's one of those cases in which when we see something happen, we will say, well, there is no surprise here. In effect, the polls are showing there is a lot of people not knowing for whom to vote, and there is a big criticism and lack of patience with political authorities. So that seems to be the perfect field for populism, no? And in a way, I believe there is a latent vote in the South that can be politicized with the classical tools of left-wing populism. No, the elite has governed against them in Peru also. This kind of left-wing is not just left-wing; it's more complicated than that. It's also centralism, Lima against the regions, the city against the rural area. There is a lot of ways in you can frame this, but basically in the classical populism discourse. And I think that's a possibility. But I have the sense that there is also a possibility coming from the right in a way in which uh, the left has not been capable of dealing with the security issue well. It has not the discourse resources to deal with it. And I think there is the possibility that this time populism comes also from the right, not necessarily from the right in defending the economic model, but from the right in being a right that attacks the current right in power. That says that they are part of the political elite that has destroyed the country, that are corrupt, and that includes the right and the left, but also the right. So there is a chance that happens. And the reason like Fuerza Popular is low in the polls and has not regained power, partly is because they are not credible populists, I think. They have more support of people that support them as an organization. It's quite low right now, but it's very difficult for Keiko Fujimori to make a credible populist discourse because they have been the ones ruling the country in the last years. No? So either as a party or either as a populist, it's very difficult for them to reposition themselves. My sense, and I may be wrong, she has been in the second round 3 times now. So, but my sense is that the only way she can get in the second round if there's nobody, no first and second climbing a little, no? If everything stays like really low and there's one that climbs but no one else, maybe. But this seems to be a really difficult election for Keiko Fujimori.
Okay, Professor, you want? Okay, you want. I see.
Yes, I mean, there's a huge demand for populism in Peru. You know, there's a huge demand, and there are all of the. If you see any textbook on political science, we have all the conditions for a populist leader. The thing is that being a populist is hard in Peru. No, it's not because populism demands some kind of talent, some kind of expertise, some kind of uh, connection with civil society. And Castillo was the perfect candidate for populism. He could have organized a very important populist leadership, right? But he didn't. No, and not because he didn't want to. He tried to be a populist. He really he put a lot of effort in becoming a populist, but he was not capable to do it because he could not actually. He didn't have enough support. He didn't have an organization. I mean, for being a populist, you need some sort of organization, a minimum organization, in order to try to organize and to go dominate the state, right? For our political actors are very weak, and I think they are weaker from the left than from the right. As Eduardo was saying, Rafael López de Aliaga, for instance, the radical right candidate that we have now, he's probably more capable to organize a populist leadership as a candidate and as a president at some point, because he has more networks, he has more capacity, more connections probably to do it. But yes, I mean, we do have an important demand for populism, but also I think there's a lot of distrust in civil society. We inherited these anti-politics identities in Peru. So there is a lot of anti-Fujimorism, a lot of anti-communism, a lot of anti-Lima identity. So we have a lot of antis, right? We have a politics full of hate, instead of love. So that also that also fuels populism, of course, but we do have a large distrust for many of the current political actors. So if we would have a populist leader, generally it would have to be an outsider, and probably we don't know yet who could it be. Like Castillo appeared like a month or 3 weeks before the elections in 2021. Before that, most people didn't know Castillo. So I think something like that could actually happen again, right? So because our demand of populism is the demand for the new, right? Not for these actors that are very, very connected with the establishment. Like Fujimori is very connected with the establishment, of course, but even I think Lopez Aliaga somehow connected with the establishment. He has already served as the mayor of Lima. He's very well known already, so it's kind of difficult to become an outsider, a populist outsider under those conditions. So we have a large
Omar,
demand.
I
Yes.
think an additional point is that it's a fragmented country in the vote. The South votes more to the left, the North is more conservative in many ways. So it's difficult to find a figure that will be this kind of swooping populist that will get like a 30-40% support, no? Maybe if everything aligns with somebody from the South that is a credible mano dura against crime, and maybe, but it's kind of difficult. It's very fragmented.
And this would have to happen it could happen like 1 month before the elections in 2026.
Okay, so thank you for your answer to the question. I can see that. I think that maybe it's a question also from Professor Bolek. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks a lot for all the presentations that were very interesting for us. I would like to ask in the same context, so in the context of the upcoming elections, how do you see the economic condition of Peru, and in what way the economic instability is going to influence the election process in Peru? Thanks.
Right now, the economy is going relatively well. I think the criticism is that it can be better because the conditions are really good and it's not as good. But I don't see it being a problem as severe or crucial as crime. That's my impression, but I am no economist, so not sure.
Yeah, it would depend on how politicians frame it, right? Because one aspect of the right of the neoliberal right is to try to say that a populist could be very interesting, but it could actually hurt the economy, right? And we have this trauma from the 80s and 90s. So we are very upset if we have like an inflation over 4%, for instance, in Peru. So that makes us very different from the rest of Latin America. No? In general, Peruvians, we are so traumatized with inflation that if our inflation is over 4%, we are very, very stressed. And I think that that resonates in a large part of the electorate, not everywhere, of course, but in a large part of the electorate, that's very important. So I think that's something important against populists from the left and populists from the right, but it would depend on the talent of the candidates, of the politicians to actually use it. As Eduardo was saying, right now, there's no anxiety about economics as in Argentina, for instance, or as in Chile. That's in Peru, that's not the issue. The issue is more about security and about hope of the future. We see a lot of people going away from the country, like migrating to other countries, because right now we are in a good economic situation, but we are seeing that in the future, this situation can really go very, very bad if the political situation continues like this, right? So it would depend, I think, on the framing of the politicians.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this answer. And actually, the last question will be, because we are very curious and actually we don't know, what will happen now to Dina Boluarte? I mean, after impeachment, what will happen to her? I mean, what she can do and what can happen to her actually?
Again, I think Omar has done something very valuable when I could give you an answer without remembering what I said when she fell. But I thought she was going to be Congress was going to say, yeah, she's guilty of everything, like just destroy her. But I think she's somehow protected right now by Congress. There is some way of taking her out of the spotlight, and maybe was part of a negotiation for this to end quickly. I don't know. She has recently appeared to ask for her impeachment to nullified, but I think she knows that's not going to happen. It's impossible. No? She has remained quiet uh, and, 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 and that's it. But I was expecting a lot of more of theater in which she was going to be like hit as the culprit of all the evils, but that has not been the case.
Yeah, see, she's protected, like this mafia is protecting one of their own, right? She's even expecting to still have some indemnization, I would say, to her. I mean, she's expecting money from the state, and I think she feels very comfortable. I thought she was gonna leave the country the night she was impeached or outside or vacated. I mean, we many of us thought she was gonna go to an embassy, the embassy of, I don't know, of some country, I don't know, but we thought she was gonna run away, right? But she didn't. She just stayed home, and she's very happy, and she declares to the camera. She says now she has time to do everything she wanted to do. She doesn't have to work so hard as she worked with us, right? And she feels really, really comfortable, right? And of course, this is a continuation of the impunity that we saw with Merino. Merino was responsible also a very brief moment of repression during 2020. And after Merino was ousted, many of us thought that somehow there was going to be some kind of uh, uh, process against him, and he would ended up in jail, or at least with some kind of political consequence. But he's doing fine, right? And he's even trying to go back to politics, right? So when we see that kind of impunity, of course, and we see Boluarte's impunity, the lesson is you can kill 2 citizens or you can kill 51 citizens and nothing happens, right? And that's a huge change in Peru after the transitional justice process we had between 2000 and 2003. The democratic Peru from 2001 to 2021 set the lesson that if you do some human rights violations like Fujimori, you will end up in jail. The lesson that we have in the last years is that you can actually get out of jail, like Fujimori did before dying, where you can go back to politics. There may be no consequences. So this Peru is much more authoritarian than the Peru that we had between 2001 and 2000.
Okay, thank you for the answer. And actually, I think that right now it's time for the last question, which is written on the chat. I will read it. I have a question about influence of humanitarian political crisis in Venezuela on Peru, and with this question, we will end our seminar. So right now, the floor for questions is closed.
Well, the impact of the Venezuelan migration is huge in Peru. There's, I think, it's the second country with more Venezuelans migrating in Latin America and the world. And it's usually used in some of the political discourse to blame for criminality in an exaggeration. No, it's not properly the case, but it has not been politicized as much as I think the proponents of that kind of discourse want. It's been less. The recent crisis, there are not many reactions. I think the government is just looking from a distance to what's happening between the United States and Venezuela. No, they're interesting time for international relations because the country right now has been working a lot with China, and the new government in the US doesn't like that kind of friendship. So we're going to see many triangulations going around with these topics. No, but that's the only thing I can say about the question.
Okay, and Professor Coronel. Okay, yeah. I
agree with Eduardo that the issue has not been, could have been more salient among politicians, right? But I am afraid there is a growing xenophobic sentiment among civil society. Not everywhere, but there is, right? I mean, as the rates of homicide and extortion goes up, I see that more people are more willing to embrace a xenophobic speech and a xenophobic discourse, right? So I am afraid during these elections that would push candidates to use more xenophobic arguments, more xenophobic frames for their speech, right? Because yes, I think there is a demand for that. And so far, for example, Lopez Aliaga was the one capitalizing that kind of sentiment. But I'm afraid maybe now leftist candidates could also use that kind of argument, because this xenophobic demand is not only among right-wing voters, right? I think it's transversal in some cases. I think there's a lot of incentives for politicians, right-wing, left-wing politicians, to use, particularly populists, right-wing, left-wing populists, to use even more brutal xenophobic discourse during these elections, connecting it with the surge in crimes and criminality.
Okay, thank you so much for your answer. And I think that it's time to end our seminar. Thank you so much, professors, for being our guests, for sharing your knowledge with us. Very important to talk about those stuff, because actually in Poland I'm not talking that much about it, and I think that is very interesting topic to discuss. So one more time, we are very, very thankful that you decided to participate in one of our seminar in our Peruvian series. One more time, thank you so much. And actually, I think that this is unfortunately the end of our seminar. If, Professor Bolek want to say something, it's the time for this.
Yes, only one sentence. So on behalf of the Faculty of Political Science and International Relations of the University of Warsaw, thank you very much for your explanations, for being here with the students. And I really hope that we can see each other in Warsaw one day when we organize some event on Latin America. We would be really happy to have you here in Poland and talk more about Peruvian politics. That is really very interesting. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thanks for the invitation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, and I will stop the recording.